Hey, welcome. So this is my second video on groups. In the first video I talked about social groups, and social groups are generally the groups we have face-to-face contact with and often can develop a sense of common identity with them because of that face-to-face contact. And the first two examples of groups that we discussed in the first video were primary groups and secondary groups. So now we're going to talk about in-groups and out-groups. In-groups and out-groups. So let's go to another page here. Hold this down. Okay. So with in-groups and out-groups, we can, oh, and by the way, I hope you caught that here on our page when we're studying groups and organizations, we have our 4 leaves here, which are actually comprise a group. So a group of 4. Okay. So in groups and out groups. So I know that's a little bit smaller because I have my screen up, but hopefully you can see that a little bit there in the background. Okay, so in-groups are those that we identify with and we have some allegiance towards those groups, and these are, and out-groups are those that we have some sense of competition towards, some hostility towards. So as opposed to primary groups and secondary groups, in-groups and out-groups may not necessarily be people that we're having face-to-face contact with. So we can be a part of an in-group where we're not necessarily interacting with them. So we may be a part of an in-group because of a category that we belong to, some social category. So social categories can be things like our sex, our sexual orientation, our religion, our disability status. So those are social categories that we can fit into. So for instance, I may have some kind of identity with people who are, also who are pet owners, for example. But I don't know all pet owners. But if there's, some kind of concern that other pet owners have, like neglected pets, or pets who've been abused, or unsafe treats or food, for example, for animals, then I have kind of an interest, like those other pet owners, in kind of trying to change that. So it doesn't necessarily mean I'm interacting with those people, but I may perceive them as an in-group, and I may perceive others as out-groups who may be maybe people who are companies that are producing unsafe food and treats for animals, which happened maybe, I want to say 7 years ago. There were dogs who were becoming sick from food produced by certain companies and certain factories, and becoming quite ill or even dying. And so those people who produce, those companies that produce that, that food, I could perceive as being a part of an out-group, right? Okay, so that's how we can look at in-groups and out-groups. And so it can be, so these can be, your in-group can be people who you're actually interacting with, but not necessarily. It can relate to just a social category, a category that you belong to, like having allegiance to other people who are females because you're a female, or allegiance to people who are males because you're a male. So that's an example. So let's start historically by looking at a few examples of in-groups and out-groups. And so these are images from the walkouts from the late 1960s, and these are Chicano students who walked out of class. And we can see from some of the signs, for example, school not prison, our kids don't have blue eyes, and I can't quite read the rest of that. education, not contempt. So there were concerns that that ethnic minority students, in particular Chicanos, or those who were, Chicano is a word used to refer to people who are Mexican American but having the unique identity of not being quite Mexican because you've assimilated, your family's assimilated into American culture, but you're not fully American because of the inequality that you experience. So the word Chicano is kind of expressing this unique identity of being Mexican and an American. So what these signs point to is that these were students who felt that they were being treated unequally, and certainly they were. So schools were unequally funded. The schools that they were attending in East Los Angeles tended to be of lower quality, so the structures themselves tended to be unsafe. The classrooms were overcrowded, so there weren't enough teachers, for example, for them. And there were teachers who treated them with, as is indicated here, treated them with contempt and didn't teach them anything about any kind of Chicano history. To give them they weren't being given anything to feel proud about. It was more of material that was praising people who were of European ancestry, who were, essentially, blue-eyed, and this is just a symbolic, comment here. So praising people who were lighter skinned and with European ancestry, and kind of ignoring any other type of history, and ignoring other groups that have contributed to the progress of the United States. So that's a problem. I mean, how do you teach kids to have positive self-esteem if they're not learning anything positive about the group that they're a part of? So these students, well, on some level we can say that they perceive themselves as being a part of an in-group because they had an identity and they were strategizing together. On the other hand, the fact that they had to walk out in order to have their voices heard also indicates to us that they were actually a part of the out-group, that they had to take this more extreme step of walking out of classrooms in order to get the school board to pay attention to what their concerns were. So whatever strategies they'd attempted before were not working. So they were still plagued by the overcrowded classrooms and the low quality in the learning materials, and what that also leads to is higher dropouts, higher rates of dropouts among those students who are who are experiencing that inequality. So they felt like, hey, this is the only way we can be heard. So with in-groups and out-groups, then what we're saying is that another kind of important component here is power, right? So power can help us to distinguish who is part of the in-group and who is a part of the out-group. The in-group, often, they don't have to stage massive protests because maybe they're the ones who are in charge already of making the rules. So let's look at another example. So a few years ago, and kind of continuing, since the election of President Trump, we've seen these women's marches, but certainly by no means is this the only time that we've seen women engage in protests. So the women's movement in the U.S. goes back a few hundred years, and we've seen intermittently, so every now and then, we've seen some massive protests. So we've seen organizing of women as well as men who support equality between females and males. If you support equality between females and males, that is feminism. So that is being a feminist. So looking for equity, believing that there should be equity. So at these marches, they're termed women's marches, but there are also men there who share their concerns. So again, on the one hand, with just a strict definition of in-groups and out-groups, we could say that those people who are participating in the marches were a part of in-groups because they have this common identity and common allegiance. But at the same time, because of the very fact that they had to go through this this effort, this massive effort in order to get their voices heard, indicates to us, suggests to us that perhaps this is a group that's an outgroup, and that those who hold the power, those who create the laws, those who are able to, for example, the sign says, "We will fight to protect reproductive rights." I mean, any group of people that does not have reproductive rights, that's a group that doesn't have power, or that's a group that lacks power in society. The people who are actually a part of the in-group, they're probably not out protesting about wanting to protect their reproductive rights, because they have their reproductive rights, correct? So those who usually take these types of extreme measures and who can motivate so many people, millions of people to come out, those are likely members of the outgroups. And outgroups have used different strategies over the years to organize and to protest. They've used boycotts, for instance, refusing to shop at certain stores that discriminate or that charge higher prices for one group as opposed to another, or boycotting the bus system because the buses were segregated, and allowing whites, people of European descent, to ride in the front of the bus, and having blacks ride in the back of the bus, or racial ethnic minorities ride in the back of the bus. So boycotts have been used, these marches have been used. So there are different ways, different strategies that outgroups have used to try to organize and to have their voices heard, and kind of force those who have power to change laws to accommodate them. Another example that we see kind of illustrating this inequality is the current case involving Brett Kavanaugh, who is a judge, and he's been nominated to the Supreme Court. And so what's going on with him? Are you familiar with that case? So what's happening is that there are a few people who've come forward and accused him of sexual assault. At the very least, accused him of rude behavior, but really sexual assault. And so what really is what we can see clarified are these in-groups and out-groups. So he represents, at the moment, Judge Kavanaugh represents a member of the in-group, because he was nominated to the Supreme Court, for one, but he was nominated by a conservative group called, or rather his name was put forward to President Trump by a conservative group, the Federalist Society, that believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And then President Trump had the ability to then put his name forward as a potential Supreme Court justice. Okay, so those are members of the in-group, and also Republicans in the Senate who support this nomination. They are members of the in-group because they are able to control the rules by which they take any testimony involving Judge Kavanaugh. So the Senate Judiciary Committee has had the ability to say, okay, we will hear testimony from accusers, people who have accused Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. Or they can have been able to say, no, we don't choose to do that. So the choice being theirs indicates to us that they are members of the in-group. So while this is taking place, we have people who lack power, lack authority, who are protesting, who are saying, no, no, no. There needs to, the testimony needs to be taken from these accusers. We can't just ignore them. But it's difficult when you lack power. When you're a part of the out-group, you are always struggling. You can feel like you're always struggling and struggling to be heard because you lack power, you lack authority. So now what the Senate Judiciary Committee has decided is that they will take testimony from one of the sexual assault accusers, and that person will testify, as will Kavanaugh. He will address the Senate Judiciary Committee on these allegations, and then, at least at this time, it's been decided that the very next day the committee will vote on whether or not to send his name forward and confirm for confirmation to the Supreme Court. Okay, so they're going to take testimony one day on Thursday, and it's now been said that Friday they're going to vote. Is that enough time? So again, they're a part of the in-group. Members of the out-group would probably say it's not enough time to consider the testimony that you've just heard. And they would also say, why not have the FBI do an investigation? If we want an unbiased investigation, if we really want to know what happened, maybe the FBI should do an investigation. But it is the current Republican Party that has the ability to make that judgment, to make that call, to say, okay, yes, we're going to have the FBI investigate, or they could say, no, we're not going to have the FBI investigate. So again, we have these basic definitions of in-groups and out-groups. In-groups, the groups that we have some camaraderie with, we identify with. Out-groups where we feel some level of hostility towards. So we have a basic definition, but you should really consider the issue of power when it comes to in-groups and out-groups, because power really tells us who's able to have control over situations, who's able to have their voices heard, their concerns heard, and who is it that is struggling to have their voices heard, their concerns heard. And those concerns can be on many different issues. It could be on like sexual assaults, as we have here in this case, or it could be on equal pay. It could be on other forms of discrimination or unequal treatment. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit better ideas as to what we're talking about with in-groups and out-groups. If you have questions for me, please let me know, and thank you for listening.